Chip, thank you so much for the invitation, and Harriet and all of your colleagues. A real delight to be with you in our dear old atrium. Kathy, oh my goodness, all that you did for us. Still doing it. Well, as Chip says, as you probably know, housing is my thing. It's been my thing for the 35 years that I've been hanging around here. And over the last year, I sort of collapsed, summarized what I was digging into, what I picked up over the years in the way of studies, my studies, our studies, studies that other people in the housing field have done. And so I produced a book. And the book, as it turned out, represents my attempt to answer a particular question, which is, why is there so much housing construction across the countryside of Northeast Ohio and so little reconstruction in places that need it? And of course, much of this discussion this morning was on reconstruction in places that need it. Now, I think it's interesting. I had the good fortune of being able to live in England a long time ago. And if you've been there, you know what I'm going to say. It is very different, and it's not just England. If you were most places in Western Europe, cities are very, very different. And so my work over the years was really sparked by what I saw and learned over there. And one thing, in the heart of the matter really is that over there, there's no sprawl. There is no urban sprawl. And the reason there isn't because government says, no, you can't do that. And so government has what some might say is a very heavy hand in controlling the housing market. For better or for worse, there are those over there who will say for worse because the cost of housing has gotten pretty high, but they control it. They control what is built where. And shockingly, you might say, the reason there's no urban sprawl is, well, farmers are not free over there to sell land for construction whenever they would like to do it. They can only sell when the government permits it according to some plan that government has established. And usually a plan that elected officials, as they come and go, can't change. Planning over there is a really serious matter. In contrast to here, whoever's the next mayor can say to the previous plan, stuff it, we're going to do a different one. And you go off down another road. But here, I think government is just as influential, but differently. And so the answer to my question about why so much out there and so little in here, the answer to the question has turned out to be this. Our government allows the development of new communities on farmland to be simple and straightforward, while allowing renewal and redevelopment of old communities to be anything but simple and straightforward. Sort of that, as I see it, is the heart of the matter. And by government, I mean mainly the state. So a central issue in the book is the state's role in housing dynamics. And a piece of that role, we all know, involves promoting rural development, most actively, of course, through road building, and a very current example is the widening of I-271, making it easier for folks to get in there, in and out from the southeast portions of the region. But the state, though, it doesn't have to be that way. The state could aim to contain rural development, somewhat anyway, as the states of Oregon, Washington, and Tennessee are doing with their urban growth boundaries. But our government does the opposite. And Ohio's policy position was made clear in 1996 when then Governor George Voinovich established the Farmland Preservation Task Force. Now, its purpose was to identify ways to preserve farmland from development. But Governor Voinovich limited recommendations to ones that would be voluntary. he would not allow, and I'm pretty sure the current governor would take the same position, would not allow any restriction on the freedom of a farmer to sell to a builder. And by the way, builders like it that way, because whenever they need cash, if they're in a good position, they can sell off 10 acres, 20 acres, or whatever, and buy a new tractor. But what the governor did not realize was that by protecting property rights of farmers out there, he was attacking the rights of property owners in here, that is closer in Cleveland, in already built places in Cuyahoga County. And I was going to say more about that in a bit. But in the 20 years since the task force did its job, voluntary actions have produced nothing of consequence in the state. Farmland preservation in Ohio is a lost cause, and it just so happens a current example, read the current issue of Cleveland Magazine, and there's an article in there about what's happening in Eaton Township over in Lorain County. And that it displays vividly why I say Ohio farmland preservation is a lost cause. Now, I speculate that the state's grossly imbalanced actions stem from our home rule form of local government. Home rule means cities and villages are independent and self-governing. But independence is not the problem. The problem is the mindset that has been cultivated by independence really over 100 years now that home rule has been the way of the state. Now, in that mindset, cities and villages are considered to be solely responsible for their condition. And why does that matter? Well, being solely responsible is fine for new and growing places, and in the book I get on Avon quite a bit out in Lorain County, new growing place. So it's solely responsible for new and growing places such as Avon, or wealthy ones such as Gates Mills. Those places have tax base that produces enough revenues to handle whatever needs come up. But home rule is no friend of long-established communities that are not wealthy, that lack vacant land for development, that need to rebuild streets and water lines, remove old trees and plant new ones, refurbish rec facilities and schools, inspect properties for code violations, demolish derelict structures, assemble parcels of land to form rebuildable sites, and on and on. Those places, very much Cleveland, very much the city of Lorain, those places lack tax base needed to contend effectively with the scale of their situation. And I emphasize the word scale. They lack resources, but are nonetheless considered to be solely responsible. They are trapped in what I call do-it-yourself survival. It started with the central cities, Cleveland, Akron being the principal ones here, and now suburbs are realizing what Cleveland has long experienced, the original suburbs, the oldest one. So the state looks at old eroding places and says, in effect, you govern yourself. Your condition is your responsibility. Good luck. And the public follows suit. Cleveland, you are old, you're worn down, you have great needs for renewal and redevelopment. That's too bad, but I don't live there. Your situation has nothing to do with me. It's your problem. You fix it. And as I see it, the game of managing old communities is actually rigged. It's rigged by the operator, the state, as its rules make winning virtually impossible. And so people, the public, they pick their residents accordingly. The dominant pattern of population movement across the 7-county region, led by the middle-class income households, is toward new and newer places and away from old deteriorating ones. It's inevitable. More move out which means that old communities that are unable to produce much reconstruction and renewal are in serious trouble. Now, yes, do-it-yourself survival is producing some advancement, and this morning it was very impressive presentation of advancement, and a bit of it was state aid, I admit that. It's most dramatic, the advancements here, downtown, University Circle, Shaker's Van Aken project. It's some advancement, but DIY survival cannot produce at the scale that is needed. And the evidence of it, that losses are exceeding gains. Across Cuyahoga County, the forces created by the pulling power of newer communities and the pushing power of deterioration, spreading deterioration, crime and high taxes are much more potent than the attracting forces that old places are able to generate through their do-it-yourself efforts. With the mainstream of population movement being toward new and newer communities, property values in older places being left behind are eroding, which gives low-income households the chance to move up to locations that would have been unaffordable 10 or 20 years ago. Weakened property value is the main reason the number of poor living in the Cuyahoga's inner suburbs is growing, while the actual number in Cleveland is decreasing. The presence of low-income households, and I'm not doing any criticism in stating this, I'm just saying factually what the dynamics are. The presence of low-income households, whether as owners or renters, means there's little capacity to finance repairs and upgrades. Decline worsens in a slow downward spiral heading toward possible abandonment. Basically what's happening, and I don't think Cleveland's the only city. I mean, certainly in the Midwest, our cities are going through a fundamental transition. We have the low income, we have the middle class, originally in suburbs. They're moving, and most of them are moving out, and most of that out now is into the counties adjacent to Cuyahoga. They're moving out, and they're saying, in effect, to the places they are leaving behind, we're no longer interested in that. We want something new, modern, we want to be away from deterioration, creeping problems, and so forth. At the same time, we have an element of society that's very interested in cities, mainly amongst younger people and older people, like me, who would rather not live way out there, but would be close in. And I think the new 20-story tower in University Circle will be very successful because there are people, older people with good incomes. They don't want to contend with a big house in Shaker anymore. They want to be across the street from the art museum, and they will have their wish. That's the transition. So the city of Cleveland is really losing its current population. It's been doing that for 50, 60 years. I expect it'll continue for another 50, 60 years. Not everybody is going to live 50 or 60 years, but those who are following them will carry on. So essentially, the lower income population is leaving the city, going into the suburbs, and the city is gaining new residents, new vitality. The problem is the losses exceed the gains. I gave the subject of abandonment quite a bit of attention in the book because it has been so prominent for the past 50 years. It's closely related to another phenomena. This, to me, is a staggering phenomena. Housing oversupply. Oversupply occurs when more housing is built in the region, and you have to look at it as a region. Really, there's only one housing market, which basically covers 7 counties. But within that one market, there are all kinds of sub-markets. But basically, there's one market, 7 counties. Oversupply occurs when more housing is built in the region than is the increase in the number of households living in the region. And we demographers can count it up every year. How many households are living in Northeast Ohio? How much of an increase? How many new housing units were built? What's the difference? What's changing in the supply? What's changing in the population to occupy that supply? Home builders, what do? They build whatever they can sell. Very different in England. Home builders build what government says they can do. Free market here. It'll always be a free market. That isn't going to change. Home builders build what they can sell. They do not call up demographers at the start of the year and ask, how many more households are likely to be in Northeast Ohio in this coming year so that we can limit our construction to that figure? They don't do that. They build what they can sell. And if it turns out to exceed household growth, so be it. And the larger the oversupply, the more properties at the bottom of the market are abandoned as people at the lowest economic level move to better places. And they leave behind structures that others are unwilling to occupy. Cleveland's and Akron in particular, Cleveland's and Akron's bad luck is that they inescapably contain most of the region's market bottom conditions. And that has been the case for decades, during which the scale of oversupply was enormous. The two cities, therefore, have borne the brunt of abandonment. I think there are many significant numbers in the book, and here's a few. In the 50 years between 1960 and 2010, new housing in our region, 7 counties, exceeded the increase in households living in the region by 287,000 units, 287,000 units, which meant that over those 50 years, 287,000 units were left vacant and abandoned. 150,000 of them were in Cleveland, which amounted to half, this to me is remarkable, which amounted to half of all the residences that existed in the city in 1960. In those 50 years, a bit every year, I was going to say slowly but surely, but in some years very rapidly. Half of all the housing that existed in 1960 was abandoned. And the city lost half its population. Akron had 41,000 units abandoned, or nearly half of all its properties that existed in 1960. It is important to note there is absolutely nothing city officials during those years could have done to prevent the disaster. The massive oversupply, over which they had zero control, doomed the old, worn-out, obsolete, least attractive properties in both cities. While the state was endorsing and promoting the production of massive housing oversupply during those 50 years, it still does, it was, in effect, saying to Cleveland and Akron, you are independent and self-governing. You and you alone are responsible for what is happening. And if the state were completely forthcoming, it would add, whatever assistance we give you, it will not be because we recognize our part in causing what is happening, certainly by not choosing to limit the outward spread of the region, but because you and your representatives were able to do enough lobbying, twist enough arms, buy enough drinks, to garner enough votes in the legislature to get whatever. If this dynamic continues, abandonment eventually will occur in suburbs, the ones least effective in preventing market bottom conditions. And East Cleveland has long passed that point. But other suburbs, and I was pleased to hear Joel Ratner mention his concern about inner suburbs, it's approaching other suburbs. Today, the oversupply is nowhere near what it was in the 1960s and 70s, which, of course, were the worst decades in the history of the city. Today, we get about 4,000 new housing units built in the region a year, half of what it was before the Grand Recession. But there's apparently zero growth in the number of households living in the region. 4,000 new units of housing. People move into the new, move, up, out, with no growth. There will be 4,000 abandoned properties as a consequence. And Cuyahoga's share is probably around 2,000 units. So as it is today, maybe up to 1,800, 2,000 units are actually being abandoned in Cuyahoga County this year, as we speak. Most of it will be in the city of Cleveland. The Ohio Constitution states, I love reading constitutions, all political power is inherent in the people. Government is instituted for their equal protection and benefit, and no special privileges or immunities shall ever be granted. Good words. By allowing and promoting unrestrained development of farmland, while doing so little to advance the renewal and redevelopment of aged communities, the state not only fails to further equal protection and benefit, it actively plays favorites and grants special privilege. It recognizes and supports those who prefer to live in new communities and virtually ignores those who prefer to live in old ones. And property owners in declining communities lose value, while owners in new ones gain value. Property rights of the latter trump those of the former. And that's what Governor Voinovich didn't understand. By considering places that are in need of renewal and redevelopment to be solely responsible for their condition, the state uses home rule to evade its constitutional duty. I call it an egregious violation of the Constitution. Not willful, but egregious nonetheless because it involves the most fundamental of societal matters, the well-being, indeed the life and death of communities. So what's the answer? Changing the mindset that has resulted from home rule is priority number one, and not just in Columbus, but locally. Indeed, I think the change has to start here. Columbus is not going to lead on anything of consequence. So it has to start here. And I think the starting point involves focusing on numbers that irrefutably document and define the situation. The critical numbers are the ones having to do with property values. You know, everything boils down to property value. If you want to know how any place is doing without consideration of how it's happening, all you have to do is look at the value of real estate and how that value is changing in relation to other places in the area. All you have to do is look at real estate. And every year, real estate numbers, the value of real estate is published by the state. Anybody can get it. It's online. We do it here. It's what we've been doing for years. Look at the numbers. Look at the numbers. Next year, Cuyahoga, I think it's next year, is doing its reappraisal. 6-year reappraisal. This year? This year. The new numbers will be telling. So the starting point involves focusing on numbers that irrefutably document and define the situation. The critical numbers are the ones having to do with property values in Cleveland, in suburbs, in the county as a whole, and this is key, in relation to neighboring counties in the region. You have to look at the regional picture. And a severe shortcoming, and I'm not being critical, about what often happens in talking about what's happening in Cleveland is total disregard to how that stands in relation to the rest of the region. You have to look at the region. In Cleveland and the county as a whole, loss has been exceeding gain. I'll tell you, I applaud everybody behind what was displayed this morning. You know, a bunch of us, Councilman Zone goes way back. I mean, I've been cheering and pulling and patting for years, and it's coming to fruition now. But loss has been exceeding gain. As of 2015, after 20 years of recovery downtown, the value of apartments and condominiums there was around $300 million, which amounted to 2% of Cleveland's tax duplicate, 2%, and 0.4% of the county's. Now, certainly the value of downtown today is higher than it was 2 years ago. Those were the most recent figures that I had. And downtown is going to keep growing. I won't be surprised if the number of residents there doubles over the next 25, 30 years. I'm very confident that is going to happen. But that advancement, coupled with severely impressively upgraded come on, Tom. But that advancement, coupled with impressively upgraded neighborhoods, are not enough to offset the losses resulting from the outflow, particularly from the suburbs. The more the suburbanites move outward, the more opportunity there is for Cleveland residents to move to suburbs. And suburban real estate does not stand vacant. You know, if a homeowner in Parma wants to move to Strongsville, puts the house up for sale, and Mayor Jackson and City Council are being so successful that nobody wants to leave the city and go to that house and buy that house in Parma, what is that owner going to do? After a while, lower the price. Nobody comes. After the while, lower the price. Nobody comes. After a while, lower. Eventually, a price will be reached where somebody, probably on the west side, Old Brooklyn neighborhood, will say, I can't pass up that bargain. Suburban housing does not become vacant, except in East Cleveland, yet in other places. Therefore, the outflow is unstoppable. Unstoppable. Thus, Cuyahoga's population keeps falling because the suburbanites are going out first. Since 2010, the county is down 30,000 residents, which compared to previous years is not that much, with most of that loss being Cleveland's. Now, in relation to neighboring counties, the figures are really sobering. Between 1994 and 2015, a 20-year period, the value of residential properties in the city of Cleveland fell by $2.27 billion. City lost $2.27 billion of residential value. The suburbs that share a border with Cleveland, the group of them combined, lost $4.73 billion. More, much more than the city of lost, for a total loss of $7 billion. The rest of Cuyahoga's suburbs gained 3.2. Lost $7 billion, gained 3.2. The net result, loss, $3.8 billion. Meanwhile, the 6 neighboring counties gained $14.5 billion. And those numbers ought to just terrify every mayor in this county, every official in this county. That tells the story. And those figures reflect Cuyahoga's nearly built-out condition. 60 years ago, 70% of the housing constructed in the region was located in Cuyahoga. 30 years ago, it was 40%. Today, it is 20%. Cuyahoga is near the end of its suburban development. If you live in Cuyahoga, which means if you live in Cuyahoga and you want a new home, 80% of your choice is in the neighboring counties. Actually, for most people, it's even greater than 80% because the remaining land in Cuyahoga, becoming a scarce resource, is higher priced, therefore demanding more expensive properties. The more moderate new construction is outside, in Lorraine County, in Medina. So the gains that the 6 neighboring counties are experiencing are because of Cuyahoga's losses. Lorraine County now is a big gainer as it leads the region in home building, having overtaken Medina County. Read the Cleveland Magazine on Eaton Township. It took 20 years for the impacts of I-90 and I-480 in Lorraine County to get rolling, but rolling they are as residents, suburbanites, are moving out of western Cuyahoga. Cuyahoga's tax base is in grave danger because growth through suburban construction is shrinking to a trickle. Which means, and this is the bottom line of the whole thing, the county's future for decades ahead depends squarely on creating much new growth, new value in Cleveland and its aged inner suburbs. You can't build any more Westlakes or Solons. That day is finished. But the county, politically, structurally, and policy-wise, in my judgment, is not oriented to doing that. Not yet. As I see it, the future of the inner suburbs has become just as critical as the future of Cleveland, if not more so. And here's the question. Over the next 20 or 30 years, will those suburbs, ringing all the way from Lakewood to Euclid, will they retain and attract enough middle-income residents to be economically viable? All of them are engaged in DIY survival. Joel Ratner mentioned the absence of assets. Most of those suburbs, Shaker is probably the one blessed the most with assets, certainly much based upon its higher income residents. But the rest, if that's to be the way forward, I'm afraid most of those suburbs are in grave trouble. If Congo County is to avoid a future marked by more loss than gain, the value of its real estate must be substantially increased in the old core. And only one goal is needed. Annually, every single year, recognizing there are going to be recessions along the way, but annually, increase the value of residential real estate more than the rate of inflation. And a target for reaching that goal is this: increase the county's share of the region's new housing from 20% to 40%. But needs for renewal and redevelopment are not confined to Congo County. They are region-wide. Every square foot of the region is aging, with some places, such as Avon, that are just starting out, while the oldest, led by Cleveland and Akron, are decades down the timeline, with the rest of the region's jurisdictions positioned between the extremes. Eventually, decades, but eventually, every place will have to deal with needs for renewal and possibly extensive redevelopment. It's an inherent feature of community evolution, right up there with death and taxes as an existential certainty. Aging is a regional matter that calls for a regional solution. And to put it another way, this one is primarily on us, the residents of Northeast Ohio. We have to want to put the region onto a new course, one that effectively balances the development of new outer communities with redevelopment and renewal of old ones. And we need the state's close partnership in doing it. But it's up to us to produce cooperatively the primary solution for the way forward, which I submit is tax-based growth sharing. The fundamental problem in all of this is tax-based. It's all tax-based, and the consequent inability of aged places to finance what is needed. The tax base is both the problem and the solution, or at least the core of the solution, because tax base can be used to promote renewal, growth, and stability. And it's ironic. The greatest need for taxes is not when a community is most able to produce them, which is when it's new and growing. If it's growing in taxes. The greatest need comes after the community has finished growing, when it has built out and aged to where it has expenses it never had before. So the rationale for regional growth sharing is this. The region creates economic growth, not individual communities. If Avon was located in the middle of Noble County in rural southeast Ohio, it would be a pleasant, sleepy hamlet. Avon's growth is not being produced by Avon, although its officials are properly planning and overseeing development projects. Avon's growth is a product of economic strength that is being produced in other communities across the region, primarily within Cuyahoga County. Thus, I conclude it would be appropriate and civically sound for a small portion of Avon's expanding tax base to be used in support of renewal and redevelopment in communities whose tax bases have passed their prime. And in Lorain County, that very much means the cities of Lorain and Elyria. Now, in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, some of you are probably familiar with this, 179 independent jurisdictions have been engaged in regional growth sharing since 1974. The Fiscal Disparities Program is unique in the nation. Annually, communities that have growth in their commercial property tax base contribute a portion of it to communities that have less growth. In that way, over time, tax-based disparity has been minimized. Now, a key feature in growth sharing is that it does not involve giving up tax base that a community already has. Rather, communities that are contributors simply have their gain reduced a bit by sharing. And the practice has no effect on taxpayers themselves. Their tax bill is the same as if there was no sharing. And furthermore, since all communities gain through growth, wherever it is located, the pressure among elected officials to compete for tax base is greatly mollified. Now, in the book, I used the example of Randall Park Mall, and I wrote that before Amazon came along. But think about it. What's the severe downside of home rule is each independent community has to fight for its tax base, that's what all the officials are doing. And they do it very pleasantly, but they are fighting for every ounce of tax base they can get. Is there any reason to cooperate as officials in producing an Amazon located wherever in the county? Not really, because wherever it lands, in this case North Randall gets the tax revenues. Does Bay Village get anything from it? No, no other jurisdiction does. I think Warrensville Heights, the school system will gain, and therefore there was a reason for Mayor Sellers to cooperate in getting that landing there. And the county, I know, gave a great deal of help. But what the real severe downside of home rule is that officials have to compete with each other. They have no rational basis to cooperate. Some may consider growth sharing to be taking from the rich and giving to the poor, or social engineering. But if the Minneapolis-St. Paul program has been economically detrimental to residents and employers, that is not apparent. In 2015, that region's median income was $71,000, compared with $51,000 here in the Cleveland-Akron region. And between 1975 and 2015, the number of jobs up there increased 894,000. Ours increased 225,000. The two regions have the same number of counties, 7, and about the same size population. The fact that growth sharing has been operating for 43 years suggests that most people up there support it. Okay, yes, to establish such a system in Northeast Ohio will be a gargantuan achievement. For openers, the better off communities probably will declare, politely of course, over our dead bodies. Even though all the neighboring counties are gaining greatly from Kiowa County, the willingness to share a bit of it for regional benefit probably is pretty close to zero. And I recall one mayor out there saying, "It's our turn. It's our turn." So assuming the regional system is out of the question for the time being, Cuyahoga County, which has the greatest needs of the 7, can establish its own. The ball is in the court of our elected officials. Now, one obstacle is the structure of local government. The Kiowa County Executive, Mr. Budish, has no authority in relation to the mayors, and no mayor has authority beyond her or his jurisdiction. Each position, in the spirit of home rule, is independent of all the others. With respect to the county's future, the buck stops nowhere. The county executive, Mr. Budish, could call a meeting of the mayors to discuss the matter, but none would feel her or his attendance was anything but voluntary. So officials, or our county officials, will have to establish a way to steer a captainless ship. And then there's the Kiowa County Mayors and City Managers Association. Mr. Budish is neither mayor nor city manager, so officially he is not a member. I suggest that the association send him a letter saying it would be honored if he would join as an official member. And then there's NOACA. That's our 5-county regional planning agency looking after mainly transportation and water quality, but a lot of what they do affects land use, of course. 5 counties, Cuyahoga, Lorain, Medina, Geauga, and Lake. And unfortunately, the region is split. We don't have a unified area-wide planning agency. Akron has its own. There ought to be one. NOACA's board is comprised of elected officials, agency heads, and technical experts from the 5 counties. NOACA has a regional strategic plan which states that, quote, A deep analysis of the region paints a vivid picture of a region at a crossroads, quote, and in need of, quote, greater regional cohesion, quote. The plan goes on to say that the board can serve, quote, serve as a forum and resource for developing opportunities for regional cooperation and collaboration, quote. Perfect words. But the board's true colors showed vividly some years ago when it almost fractured in dispute over adding a lane to I-71, which, by the way, I like, because 3 lanes going out I-71 from Cuyahoga into Medina is a lot easier than 2 lanes. But anyway, it almost fractured. Medina County threatened to pull out of the agency and to try and get Lorain County to go with it. When it comes to municipal or county growth and tax-based growth, it is dog eat dog. Polite, yes, polite, civil, but dog eat dog nonetheless. That is the compulsion fired by home rule. I have a suggestion for the NOACA board. At one of its future meetings, put the following 2 statements, excuse me, on the wall. Put 2 statements on the wall. 1, a deep analysis of the region paints a vivid picture of a region at a crossroads and in need of greater regional cohesion. Statement number 2, between 1994 and 2015, the value of residential real estate in Cuyahoga County declined $3.8 billion, while in neighboring counties, value increased $14.5 billion. With those statements on the wall, I suggest that the board members reflect on them for several minutes, maybe in silence, and then discuss the question, what are we going to do about this? I see that Mr. Budish, I'm not on Mr. Budish, it's just factual again. I see that Mr. Budish is on the NOACA board as a first vice president, in line, I assume, to be president next year. So we all stay tuned. In closing, in the book, I quote an advertisement that appeared in 1921 for a major housing project. The ad reads, from even the finest home communities, now that means in 1921 neighborhoods, so from even the finest neighborhoods around Cleveland, old families have been forced away because undesirable buildings, features, neighbors could not be kept out. But not in Shaker Heights. Protective restrictions operate for 78 years to come. We create it, we sell it, the Van Swearingen Company. Now, the home communities and the old families referred to in that ad were the city's wealthy, the wealthiest, and the elite, who had been living on Euclid Avenue, our grand old millionaire's row, on Euclid and nearby streets in the late 1800s. And it's true, they were indeed forced out by the eastward spread of downtown growth, buildings, and activities. Old families forced away, undesirable buildings, features, neighbors, protective restrictions. To me, those words convey disruption, anxiety, loss, emotional pain. That was 96 years ago. Since then, there has been more or less continuous disruption, anxiety, loss, emotional pain at numerous locations in Northeast Ohio, and many, many within Cuyahoga County. We don't know what widespread community stability is. It is foreign to our experience. If anything, we take for granted that once decline starts somewhere, the odds are there's no stopping it, as if it was God's will. We get what government promotes. And when government makes the renewal and redevelopment of old places at least comparable in priority to the construction of new ones out in the countryside, then we will begin to know what community stability is and what a difference it makes in our sense of well-being. It can happen, and I believe in time it will happen. So, thank you again for having me, and best wishes in your continuing activities on behalf of fair lending and vital communities. Thank you.